The trial of Daniel Knox, the homeless veteran who made a judge stand still in tears after he was brought as the man who stole bread. Daniel Knox was a ghost in the rain. Rain fell in sheets, the kind that blurred the city skyline like a half-forgotten memory. It had been raining since before dawn, a cold, soaking rain that turned the gutters of Seattle into grey rivers and made even the hardened baristas of Pine Avenue mutter curses beneath their breath. The clouds sat low over the city, as if pressing it into the pavement. Daniel Knox walked slowly, almost invisibly, through the murk. To most, he was just a silhouette beneath the brim of a fraying baseball cap. His coat was army green, bulked with patches and stitched tears, and his boots, once a regulation tan, were now muddied and black with years of city grime. His gait had a stiffness to it, like every step was a quiet argument with his joints. No one knew his name. To the morning commuters who passed him like he was part of the landscape, he was just Boots. Boots sat on the bench outside Harper's Cafe nearly every morning, always just as the place opened, always quiet, always still. He didn't beg, didn't speak. He just sat, watching the steam rise from the windows, sometimes nodding to the first customers as they came and went. Some of the cafe workers speculated about him. Vietnam vet, one barista claimed. Nah, too young, said another. Afghanistan or Iraq, maybe. None of them asked. Not really. They offered him a muffin on occasion. Once, a girl named Sophie slipped him a paper cup of coffee. He took it without a word and nodded. The next morning, the cup was cleaned and returned, set neatly beside the trash can. He was a man out of time, a ghost in the rain. What no one saw, what no one could have known, was that beneath the layers of fabric and silence was once a soldier who commanded a logistics division through the hostile terrain of Kandahar. A man who had read supply maps under flickering red lights and screamed over radio static while insurgents cracked the air with bullets. He had once held a dying girl in his arms, a child no older than 10, and whispered the lyrics to "You Are My Sunshine," while the ground trembled with distant mortars. That memory stayed with him, like shrapnel buried too deep to remove. But the world forgot Daniel Knox, and in many ways he had begun to forget himself. That morning, as the rain pelted the streets and his joints ached with the cold, Daniel felt a hunger he hadn't felt in weeks, not just in his stomach, but something deeper, more primal, a need for warmth, for meaning, for remembrance. He pulled his coat tighter and began walking. Past the rusted bus stop on 7th, past the church with the leaking steeple, past the Veterans Center that had closed last year due to funding. He spoke no words, but he was whispering inside. Marie, I still see you. I still see your hands. He remembered the last time he'd seen her. Fragile, surrounded by plastic tubes, her voice barely louder than a breath. They won't listen, she had said. Tell them I'm not crazy. It's not just fatigue. He had tried. Had shouted at doctors in polished shoes with their eyes glued to charts. They told him it was stress. Told her it was anxiety. The truth came too late. It was lymphoma. Stage 4. A silent killer in her blood that moved faster than the bureaucracy could respond. By the time Daniel landed back in the States, delayed by 2 missed convoys and a sandstorm over Kabul, Marie had already been buried. He'd never been to the funeral. That was the day the silence started. Now, almost a decade later, he moved like a man underwater. Each step felt heavier. He hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days, save for a half-eaten protein bar someone left on a bus bench. He ignored the growling in his belly until it became more like an ache. then a dull numbness. As the morning dragged on, the rain finally slowed, though the cold sharpened. Daniel found himself on Eastlake Avenue, staring through the fogged-up window of Rowley's Market. Inside, there were bins of day-old bread stacked near the front, a single cashier, a security camera in the corner. The store was quiet. He hesitated, then moved inside. The warmth hit him first, not just physical, but emotional, like stepping into another world. A woman in her 60s browsed the soup aisle. The cashier, a bored-looking kid with earbuds tucked under his hoodie, barely glanced at him. Daniel walked slowly, purposefully, past the cereals, past the canned beans, to the bread. He looked at the labels, all marked down. $1.49, 89 cents. One baguette, crusted tough, probably too stale to sell tomorrow, sat alone on the shelf. He reached for it. His fingers hesitated. Then he tucked it beneath his coat. He didn't run, didn't look around. He simply walked, as if he hadn't done anything wrong, as if walking was the only thing left to him. But just as he reached the sliding doors, a voice cut through the air like a blade. "Hey, you planning on paying for that, old man?" Vincent Rowley, the owner, came storming out from behind a rack of paper towels, red-faced and furious. He had seen it on the monitor. Daniel froze, then turned. "I just needed the strength," he said quietly, "to live one more day." Rowley didn't hesitate. He picked up the phone and dialed 911. When Officers Patel and Carson arrived, Daniel was already seated on the curb, hands folded over his knees like a soldier awaiting orders. The baguette lay beside him, unwrapped, soaked from the rain. "You really a vet?" Carson asked, noticing the dog tags half hidden beneath Daniel's coat. Daniel nodded. "Was," he said, "a long time ago." They didn't cuff him, just helped him up and escorted him to the cruiser. There was no resistance, no protest. Daniel Knox, once a leader of men in battle, was arrested for stealing bread, and no one noticed the judge who would hear his case the next morning. A man named Elliot Hammond had once knelt beside Daniel in the dust of Kandahar, bleeding from a gash in his thigh, while Daniel dragged him to safety under fire. The past was coming, and it would demand to be remembered. The patrol car was warm, too warm. The heater blasted stale air as the officers drove through the wet streets, the rain now just a whisper against the windows. Daniel sat in the back, silent, hands resting in his lap. His stomach gnawed at itself, the taste of bread never arriving. Carson, the younger of the two officers, glanced at the rearview mirror. He had that look, part suspicion, part curiosity. "You really a vet?" he asked again. Daniel didn't answer this time. He was thinking about the desert, the way the sun had painted the world in gold and blood, the way dust stuck to sweat and boots felt like anvils after 20 clicks. He remembered the weight of radio gear, the static of comms, the whine of distant rotors. But most of all, he remembered Hammond, Private Elliot Hammond, fresh out of upstate New York, wide-eyed, too clean, too polite, a medic with hands that shook during his first extraction. Daniel had taken him under his wing, not because he had to, but because something in Hammond reminded him of himself, long before the war. They had survived a convoy ambush together. Daniel pulled Hammond out of a burning Humvee just seconds before it exploded. Hammond had wept afterward. Daniel never mentioned it again. He wondered if Hammond had made it back okay. The holding cell smelled of bleach and despair. Daniel was processed like everyone else, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of his belongings. They gave him a sandwich he couldn't finish and a thin blanket that didn't warm much. He slept sitting up, back against the wall, trying not to think. No calls, no visitors. He didn't even remember sleeping. Only the metallic screech of the door the next morning and the sound of a name being called. Knox. Courtroom 6B. They led him down the hall in handcuffs. The floor was cold. His boots taken during booking had been replaced with county-issued slip-ons. He shuffled like a man decades older. Courtroom 6B was already in session. The gallery was nearly empty. A few attorneys, a couple reporters, one woman knitting. Behind the bench sat a man with iron-grey hair and sharp shoulders, robed, still. His nameplate read, Honorable Elliot Hammond. He didn't look up immediately. Next case, the clerk called. State of Washington versus Daniel Knox. The prosecutor, a woman in her 40s, rose and began reciting the facts. Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended while attempting to steal a loaf of bread from a market on Eastlake Avenue. The store owner pressed charges. Due to prior citations, loitering, trespassing, we recommend remand pending trial. Hammond glanced at the case file, then froze. His fingers curled around the edges of the folder, as if it had turned to fire in his hands. His eyes scanned the name again. Daniel J. Knox. His breath caught. He looked up. The man standing before him was older, weathered, thinner, but the eyes, the posture, the stillness, it was him. Without a word, Judge Elliot Hammond rose. Gasps echoed around the courtroom. Hammond stepped down from the bench. I'm calling a recess, he said. His voice barely steady. 15 minutes. He disappeared into chambers, without another word. And Daniel stood there, confused, haunted, not knowing that someone had just remembered. The court reconvened an hour later. Judge Hammond did not return to the bench. Instead, a new judge took his place, a substitute. There were whispers, confusion, and then came the shock. Judge Elliot Hammond filed a formal motion to recuse himself from the case on personal grounds. And then he did something no one saw coming. He filed to represent Daniel Knox as his defense attorney. Gasps filled the courtroom. Daniel sat, silent, stunned. When Hammond entered the holding room later that day, Daniel didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared. Elliot, he said, barely above a whisper. It's me, Hammond replied. Daniel tried to rise. His knees buckled. Hammond caught him. You shouldn't be here, Hammond said. I got lost somewhere, Daniel replied. And thus began the unraveling. Over the following weeks, Hammond dug deep. He found Daniel's military records, commendations, citations, honors. He found VA documents that told a story of abandonment, denied benefits, ignored appeals, medical neglect. He found Marie's letters, her pleas, her despair. He found a man who had fallen, not from weakness, but from a system that never caught him. Hammond didn't just build a defense. He built a mirror, and the world began to take notice. Word of the case spread like wildfire, first through courthouse whispers, then through a quiet article published by a young journalist at the Seattle Tribune. The headline read, Judge steps down to defend homeless veteran who once saved his life. Within hours, it was shared on veterans' forums. By the next morning, it was national. Strangers began showing up outside the courthouse. Some were veterans, some were survivors of homelessness. Others were just people who read the article and couldn't sleep until they had done something. They brought coats, food, letters, drawings from children addressed simply to Mr. Daniel, who was brave. Hammond filed motion after motion. One of them, a request for dismissal on humanitarian grounds, caused a ripple through the legal community. He argued that Daniel Knox had paid a price beyond any court sentence, that his suffering was not criminal but systemic, that to prosecute him for theft was to prosecute a ghost for being forgotten. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, over 80 letters were submitted to the court, one from a nurse at Tacoma General Hospital, where Marie Knox had passed away. He used to bring her paper flowers when he couldn't afford real ones. He'd sit for hours and read aloud from old paperbacks. Another came from a retired teacher in Puyallup. Daniel once fixed my roof after a storm and refused payment. Said, "Just pay it forward, ma'am." One particularly powerful letter was from a man who had served under Knox. "He took a bullet for me. You want to jail that man for bread?" The prosecution hesitated, then stalled, and finally they agreed. They would not oppose the motion to dismiss. The courtroom was standing room only on the day of the hearing. People lined the aisles. Reporters were kept outside. A single camera recorded proceedings for the public record. Daniel sat in a borrowed suit, his beard trimmed, his shoulders back. His medals, carefully placed in a wooden case, sat quietly beside him. Judge Miriam Lagrange presided, stern, sharp-eyed, a woman who had no tolerance for theatrics. Hammond stood. He did not read from notes. He spoke from memory, from the soul. He was a protector before he became a ghost. He bore our weight, our fears, our failures. We sent him into the fire, and when he came back burned, we left him outside in the cold. This is not justice unless it heals. This is not justice unless it remembers. There was no sound as he finished. Lagrange looked at Daniel, then at Hammond, then at the file before her. "This is highly irregular," she said, "but necessary." She banged the gavel. Case dismissed. No one clapped. Not at first. It was too sacred, too still. And then quietly, someone wept. Daniel turned to Hammond. His voice cracked. "Thank you for remembering me." The morning after the case was dismissed, Daniel stood on the courthouse steps, beneath a sky no longer choked by rain. For the first time in years, the clouds above him parted to reveal not sun, but light, the kind that doesn't shine, but rests, soft, forgiving. He hadn't known what to expect after freedom. Jail was gone, yes, but so was the bench he used to sleep on. So was the silence he had grown used to. In its place were eyes, cameras, open palms, voices calling his name as if he had been someone real all along. Elliot Hammond stood beside him, not as a judge, not as an attorney, but simply as a man. "I don't know what to do next," Daniel admitted, his voice rough from disuse. "You live," Hammond said, "whatever that means for you now." The local VA office called the same day. The case was dismissed. Their tone was very different this time. "Mr. Knox, we're fast-tracking your claim," the clerk said. "Housing assistance, medical coverage, PTSD treatment. We'll expedite it all. Someone will pick you up this afternoon." But when they arrived, Daniel was already gone. He didn't want a parade of paperwork. He didn't want another bureaucrat to pretend they cared because headlines told them to. He walked instead, to the edge of the Sound, where ferries cut lines through the water and gulls circled like white ghosts. A small crowd followed at a respectful distance, not out of spectacle, out of reverence. Daniel paused at a bench, this one dry and clean. Someone had left a thermos of coffee and a blanket there. A handwritten card read, "You matter, always did." He sat. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he wept, not from pain, from the overwhelming ache of being seen. That night, the news aired a special segment, the trial that made America look again. Within a week, Daniel had a place to stay, a small studio in a transitional housing program for veterans, offered through a non-profit overwhelmed with donations since the trial. But Daniel didn't stay long. He asked to be moved to a program where he could work, earn his rest. "I've had enough sitting still," he said. "I need to give back." The director, a veteran herself, smiled. "Then how about this? How would you feel about running the community garden?" So that's what he did. Every morning, Daniel arrived early, watered the soil, repaired the fences, showed younger vets how to coax tomatoes from hard earth and laughter from hard days. Kids from nearby schools visited for field trips. One little boy, wide-eyed and missing a front tooth, asked him, "Mr. Daniel, were you in a real war?" Daniel nodded. "Yeah, but I fight better battles now." Weeks later, Hammond returned with a box. "I found this in a storage unit. It was sealed after the hospital closed. Inside were 19 letters, all addressed to Daniel, all written by Marie during her final days. The last one was dated just 3 days before she died. It read, "My love, I don't know if these words will ever find you, but if they do, I hope they wrap around your heart and remind you who you are was never lost, only waiting. Promise me one thing. If the world ever finds you again, let it. Don't hide from kindness. You've carried enough weight. It's time someone carries you. I'll wait. Somewhere, yours always." Marie Daniel didn't speak for a long time. Then he whispered, "She always knew." With the media attention, donations poured into a new initiative launched by Hammond and others. The Knox Redemption Fund, a legal defense and rehabilitation fund for homeless and underserved veterans facing misdemeanor charges. Daniel's case became precedent. His story became required reading at several law schools. A group of young lawyers began calling themselves the Knox Cadre, vowing to defend those who had defended them. But Daniel rarely attended the galas or press events. He preferred his bench, his soil, his silence, and occasionally, his stories. A year passed. The rains returned. Daniel was on his bench, watching seedlings fight through the last frost, when a young man in uniform approached him. "Sir, are you Daniel Knox?" "Yes." The boy straightened, nervous. "My dad, he served with you, said if I ever met you, I should say thank you." Daniel studied him, then reached out and clasped the boy's shoulder. "You tell your father," he said. "Thank you for remembering me." When Daniel Knox passed 5 years later, peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by community, his memorial wasn't held in a cathedral. It was held in the garden. They buried his ashes near a maple tree he had planted himself. A simple plaque read, "Sergeant Daniel J. Knox. He carried us and we remembered." And every spring, as the cherry blossoms bloomed and the vegetables sprouted, people came to sit by his tree, not to mourn, but to remember. Because in the end, Daniel Knox wasn't the man who stole bread. He was the man who showed the world what it meant to deserve it. If you believe that no one should be forgotten, that every life deserves dignity, and that one story can change how we see the world, subscribe to Heartwarming Real-Life Moments. Share Daniel's story. Help someone feel seen today.